Hi everyone. In this lecture we're going to continue our discussion of chapter 14, but instead of talking about constant allele frequencies, we're going to talk about all of the reasons why allele frequencies change in populations. So we'll discuss why we don't see constant allele frequencies and the conditions that lead to these non-constant or changing allele frequencies, things like non-random mating and migration, drift, mutation, and selection. So, in our first lecture on chapter 14, we talked about all of the different things that we could do if allele frequencies stayed the same in a population. So, we could use it to predict phenotypes of future generations, and we could use it to look at frequencies of things like cystic fibrosis and Tay-Sachs and all of these disease alleles. But the problem is in an actual population, allele frequencies don't stay the same, and there's a lot of reasons why that could be. If we sort of go to the macro level and we look at just things that make populations change. Wars and persecutions, that's sort of a big one why you might see a flux in population and allele frequencies. Wars tend to usually conscript young men of various ages. And so you could have a lot of genetic diversity lost, especially if you lose a lot of young men in times of wars and conflicts. You also see people driven out of places, again, usually by some larger level of persecution. You might have huge numbers of refugees who are leaving populations to get away from that persecution. So again, that's another reason why we might see changing allele frequencies. We also have economic and political systems at play here. And that also sort of leads back into our discussion of persecution and things like that and where that persecution is coming from. Religious preferences can play a part in why allele frequencies change, specifically the idea of certain religions wanting their offspring or wanting their kids to stay within their own faith, right? So this idea of Jewish people wanting to marry and have offspring with other Jewish people, or Catholic people with Catholic people, or whatever it happens to be. And that kind of leads into our next selection of mate choices and who we choose as our mates. There's a very sort of biology behind the process of choosing someone to be our partner and why we do that, and that leads to changing allele frequencies. Shifting populations. People move and their genes move with them. So when we have migrations, immigrants moving from one population to a next, they take their alleles from where they started from and they add those alleles to their new population. And then just things like diseases and disasters. So large natural disasters, especially when we have large numbers of people who may perish because of these disasters. In a small population in particular, that would impact the allele frequencies in that population greatly. So let's talk about the conditions in which allele frequencies can change, and we're going to go through all of these individually. Oops, I went through that too fast. We're going to talk about all of these individually, but these are sort of, if you look at the kind of the biology behind some of these things and exactly why these allele frequencies are changing in a population. So let's start off with non-random mating first. In a population, if there was an equal chance of everyone mating with everyone else, regardless of what their genotype and phenotype happened to be, we would consider that random mating. And in the case of random mating, all of the allele frequencies would stay the same because every individual in the population has an equal chance of reproducing with someone else in the population. So there's no preferences. And so we would keep all of our allele frequencies the same. So for example, let's take a population of beetles. And let's say we have 3 different colors of beetles. Okay, we have these, let's call it a beige beetle, and a brown beetle, and a yellow beetle. In a random mating situation, this brown beetle would equally choose to mate with any one of these other beetles. And if that happens, we would keep the frequency of all of these different colors the same in the population, because there's an equal chance that we could mate with anybody. But what happens more often than not in populations is non-random mating. Individuals of one genotype will reproduce more often with each other versus others. So kind of this idea is like attracts likes. So rather than the brown beetle wanting to mate with the beige beetle or the yellow beetle, the brown beetle chooses to only mate with the brown beetle. And so they make more brown beetles. Okay? So again, because of this preference that they have, this idea of non-random mating, we might see certain alleles, like the brown allele, go up in a population, and other alleles potentially could go down in the population based on mate selection and preference. So again, non-random mating just means that individuals of one genotype tend to reproduce more often with each other than they reproduce with others. And even as us, as humans, we tend to marry people similar to ourselves about 80% of the time. So again, we tend to seek out individuals who are like us, okay? And whether that is based mostly purely on looks, but it could be other things as well. And that's just sort of a thing that happens in biology in general. Now, it doesn't mean that, of course, there aren't exceptions to every rule, and there are plenty of individuals who choose mates that are very different than themselves in physical appearance. But, as again, it just is more of a convention or something that we see more often happening is this idea that we're mating with people, again, choosing partners that look like us rather than look different from us. And traits that influence our mate choice include all kinds of things. Again, it could be physical appearance. That could be the reason why we're choosing a mate. It could be an ethnic or religious preference that we have. It could be intelligence or shared interests. So again, there's a lot of things that we could look for in a potential mate that makes them like us. It doesn't necessarily always have to be physical in appearance. But again, if we have more in common with that person, we're more likely to choose them with a partner than if we have less in common with that person. So again, kind of on this topic of non-random mating, this is something that is seen a lot, especially looking at ethnic and religious preferences. So in a lot of communities in the world, you have very isolated communities. So you think of very rural parts of the world where you don't come in contact with people that are different from you. The only options you have are people who are similar to you. So worldwide, a third of all marriages are between people that are born within 10 miles of each other. It's called endogamy, and it simply means that, again, when you live in a rural, isolated area, it's not easy to go somewhere else and seek out a potential mate. It just doesn't work that way because of, again, mostly political or economic reasons. You live in the village that you live in, and you either find someone in the village to be your mate, or you find someone in the village next door to be your mate. But you're not going to be traveling across the country very likely. We also have cultures in which consanguinity is more prominent. So consanguinity is marriage between relatives, not necessarily first cousins, but typically second or third cousins. This idea of preserving bloodlines, it's kind of a way of thinking that, again, was very dominant, especially in monarchies in European countries. Throughout the past several centuries, there was a lot of consanguinity. You had a lot of, even in some cases, first cousins marrying each other in royal bloodlines because there were so few royal bloodlines. You still do see that in some cultures, that you sort of stay within your family and keep those bloodlines distinct. And then we have cultures in which polygamy is allowable and is actually the cultural norm. So you have one man who fathers children with many different wives. Again, it's culturally relevant in different places, not necessarily here in the United States, but in other cultures you still see it, and it's one man will have an unequal contribution, right? So there'll be an awful lot of his genes will be passed on through his children, but other men who might not have any wives, let alone multiple wives, will have much fewer of their genes passed on to the next generation. Migration is pretty simple as we go thinking about changing allele frequencies. When people move, their genes move with them. So allele frequencies change when alleles are disproportionately distributed in the migrants. So what that means is that if you have a group of migrants who represent a large proportion of an unusual gene or trait, let's say polydactyly, for example, and you have a group of people who migrated here to the United States and a disproportionate number of them had that trait, polydactyly, then the population into which they migrate into will also now have an unusually high proportion of people with polydactyly. Remember, polydactyly was people with extra fingers or toes. So this is a real simple map that actually is showing net migration patterns. So places in blue are where we see people moving to, places in brown are where we see people moving from, and places in green are sort of no net movement of people. And then those areas in gray are places where we don't have data from. So immigrants are the people that come to a country. We call them the immigrants with an I, and emigrants with an E is the people who are leaving a country. So you are both an emigrant and an immigrant, depending on which country you're talking about. All right, let's do a quick comprehension check. Which of the following is an example of random mating? A polygamist who has 3 wives and 15 children, a Danish prince marrying a Belgian princess, Will and Kate, a Chinese farmer who marries a woman from his rural village. So actually the answer is number 3. If you don't know who I'm talking about, we're looking at William and Kate, the Duke and Duchess of Cambridge. So again, they're an example of a random mating. So the polygamist was non-random. The bloodlines here, the Danish prince and the Belgian princess, were non-random. The Chinese farmer was non-random, but Will and Kate met in college. So that was a nice sort of non-random mating story. All right, next, genetic drift. So sometimes genetic drift happens when allele frequencies change randomly for no particular reason. It's not because people are moving. It's not because people are mating with certain individuals. It's just chance. It's purely chance. So genetic drift happens when allele frequencies change just because. You don't really notice genetic drift except when you have a really, really small population. And when you have a really small population, you don't have a lot of alleles to begin with. And so if some of those alleles disappear, it's going to have a really big impact on that population. So in this case, we're going to go back to the beetles, and we're going to go back to this case. Let's say we had green beetles and we had brown beetles. And there are a few green beetles and there are more brown beetles. And let's say just by chance, some person happened to come along and step on green beetles. It greatly reduced the number of green beetles in this population, and it had a really big impact now on the number of green beetle alleles, right? But this was a chance, random occurrence. It didn't happen on purpose. So in the next generation, there's going to be a lot more brown beetles than there will be green beetles, simply because there are more brown beetles to start with than there are green beetles. So sometimes genetic drift is simply some individuals get lucky, they get to reproduce, and they get to pass on their genes and their traits, and other individuals don't, and that's referred to as drift. Let's see, I'm just trying to think about, we kind of already talked through this. If there's a low frequencies of alleles, there's not very many copies, and again, it becomes more pronounced the fewer number of alleles that we have. There are a couple of sort of special types of drift. One is called the founder effect. And this is when we have a small sample of a larger population establishes a new population, and sometimes that sample's gene pool is different from the larger populations. It's called the founder effect. So we're going to talk about an island of lizards now, and let's say we had an island of lizards where we had gray lizards and red lizards, and on this island there's more gray lizards than red lizards. But let's say somehow the couple of red lizards and a gray lizard happened to hop on a piece of floating debris, and they floated off this island and they landed on a new island. Well, on our new island, we'd have had a lot more red lizards than we'd have gray lizards, because we had a founder population that had a higher frequency of the red allele than the gray allele. So this new population isn't representative of the old population, right? The red allele frequency is much higher than it was originally. That's called the founder effect. Another thing we see is a population bottleneck. A population bottleneck is where we have a short-lived population size reduction followed by a really rapid increase. And like the founder effect, it results in a different population from the original. So let's go back to our lizards. And now we have a tidal wave that comes. And the tidal wave happens to wipe out almost all of the gray lizards. And there are very few gray lizards left. So in our new population, again, the red allele becomes a much bigger part of the population because we lost so many of these gray lizards. Okay, so again, that would be a population bottleneck. Drift in human populations. So we have a history of small populations, in humans, and so we have been vulnerable to genetic drift at different times in human history, but it hasn't seemed to impact. It's led to really superficial differences in humans. There isn't anything sort of dramatic that has happened to us because of genetic drift. All right, let's go through another comprehension question. A higher incidence of polydactyly among Pennsylvania Amish could be best explained by migration, non-random mating, the founder effect, both non-random mating and the founder effect, or none of the above. So there's a group of people in Pennsylvania, Amish, and they have a really high incidence of polydactyly, which is extra fingers and toes. How do we explain it? It's actually number 4. It's both non-random mating and founder effect. So this original group of people who came over to found this population in Pennsylvania had a high incidence of polydactyly. And then, because as Amish, they tend to stay within their own religion for religious preferences and only marry other Amish people, we continue to preserve that high incidence of polydactyly. All right, next factor is mutation. So mutation happens to be the source of all genetic variation in a population. So every new allele that we have in a population comes because a mutation happened. So blue eyes were a mutation. Green eyes were a mutation. Straight hair was a mutation. So you name it, and there's a whole host of things that arose by mutations. So we can introduce new alleles. Mutation in and of itself has a very small impact. It takes a long time for a mutation to turn into a polymorphism, right? Remember, a polymorphism is where we actually see a large number of people have that allele. So unless you're talking about a very, very small population, it's not going to lead to changing allele frequencies rapidly. It would be over long periods of time. And last but not least is selection. And my entire next lecture, which is based on chapter 15, is going to be about natural selection. So sometimes the environment can make individuals with certain traits more likely to survive and reproduce. And because of that, selection can increase or decrease the frequency of an allele. So sometimes you have a change in an environment. The environment gets really, really warm, or maybe it gets really cold, or a fire comes through and it eliminates a bunch of individuals. So there's lots of things that could happen. But in that environment, some of the individuals there are going to be successful. They're going to survive that change and they're going to reproduce. And when they do that, the allele frequencies of that population are likely to shift because those that were more successful and reproduce more get more of their alleles in the next generation. So that's kind of the basis behind selection. And again, we're going to have an entire lecture based on this idea of natural selection, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about it, but one place that it particularly becomes relevant is when it comes to bacterial populations. So bacteria have populations just like any other living thing, and what's interesting is that they can become resistant to antibiotics. They can evolve resistance. What that means is a mutation happens in one bacterial colony, and that mutation becomes successful and enables that colony to reproduce. And then the more they reproduce and the more they grow, the more that resistance spreads. And so this is something that is very relevant to medicine right now, is this idea of antibiotic resistance. Okay, important terms and concepts to know for wrapping up Chapter 14. Next, we're going to move on to 15 and natural selection.